What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to learn about the data source pattern in your apps. So here's a view that we have. It's pretty simple. We've got an image view and a label, but what we're going to build out is a functionality where we can supply our actual image URL and label title here via a data source and protocol. This is similar to how Apple has built their TableViews and CollectionViews and all of those heavily used objects. So it's pretty important to know as an iOS dev. So if that all sounds good, make sure you start by destroying that like button down below. Helps out a lot. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and into iOS. That said, let's get into the video. Alright, let's go ahead and get started by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. We're going to stick with the app template under iOS, and let's go ahead and give this a name of DataSource example. Make sure your language is set to Swift, lifecycle is UIKit, and interface is storyboard. Go ahead and continue, save the project wherever you'd like, and first things first, let me close this right panel and expand our Xcode window and jump into our viewController.swift file. So essentially what we want to do is we want to have a view that is going to show the title for a particular image as well as the image itself. So that view is going to rely on its data source to fill in that information. So let's go ahead and create that view first and foremost. So I'm also going to go ahead and create a function here, and it's going to be called fetch data. And I grabbed a URL right before recording this video, so let's go ahead and just create a URL out of it. The URL just returns some basic JSON with that information in it for our image title as well as the URL. So we're going to use that in just a little bit to hook up our data source. But first things first, we actually need to create that view. So we can create it right down here, or we can create it as its own file. Let's create it as its own file. So we'll right click this and hit new file. We want to create a Cocoa Touch class, and we are going to subclass a UI view. And maybe we can go ahead and call this a, I don't know, maybe a image info view. Now go ahead and create it, save it in the default location, and this is what you will end up with. So now what do we want in here? The first thing that we want in here, of course, is a image view, and this is going to be, you guessed it, the view that shows our image once we actually have an image to show. So I'm going to create it here with the anonymous closure pattern. We'll go ahead and create it. I'm going to return it. I'm also going to assign its content mode to be perhaps scale aspect to fill. And then we'll also say imageview.clips2bounds is true. And we're also going to set a background color to it because by default, we're not going to have an image and we want to see something on our UI. So now that we've got an image view created there, let's go ahead and override the initializer with a frame. We'll say super init. We'll also need to bring in the required initializer. And we want to lay out our image view. So we'll override layout sub views. And maybe we'll go ahead and give our image view a frame. So we'll say the frame is going to be cgrect 00250 by 250, and then we'll go ahead and center this. So we'll say imageview.center will be the current center of this particular view. So now that we've gone ahead and created this, let's go put this on our controller so we can actually see it on our simulator. So I'm going to go ahead and create an instance of it. So here we can go ahead and say our info view is going to be this image info view. We want to, of course, add it as a sub view. So we'll say go ahead and add it. And then we also want to, of course, lay it out in view.did_layout sub view. So we'll go ahead and override that. And I'll go ahead and give this a frame. Maybe we'll give it a frame of view.frame.size.width -20. I'll do the same thing for the Y here, and then we'll go ahead and center this. So I can go ahead and say info view.center is view.center. So hopefully everyone is still keeping up. Let's go ahead and pick a simulator here, and let's just go ahead and run it. And what I expect to see is our info view as well as the black square in the middle, which represents our image view. So bear with my simulator here. Momentarily, we should see it. The other thing we also need to do is add a label into our info view, because that's going to hold the title for that particular image. So hopefully the simulator is just being slow and I didn't forget to do something. So bear with it here. All right, we're not seeing it, which is not good. So let me set a background color to this guy to at least make sure we're seeing that. So we'll go ahead and do that. I'll set a background color there. All right, we see our red square, which is good. Let's jump back to our info view. Let's see what's up here. So we created this image view. We set a black background color. We never added it as a sub view. That's slightly important. Let's go ahead and do that. Try that one more time. And now we should expect to see that black square in the center of it. Now the reason that it's overflowing and it's not looking too hot is because our sizing is not correct actually. What I'll actually do instead of centering it here is we'll go ahead and center it horizontally. So let me just go ahead and line break all of this, but here we'll go ahead and say that the X is going to be the frame.size.width minus the 250 that we gave the width of this image view divided by 2. And there is our black image view. Now let's go ahead and add our label in here, and then we'll jump into the data source business. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this. We can call this a title label. It'll be of type UI label. And we can just go ahead and configure some of the label information in here. So what do we need to do for the label? Well, we're going to align its text to be centered. And I'm also going to bump up the font size to be perhaps system font size of size maybe 22. So let's go ahead and also give it a default text of maybe a dash so we can actually see it showing up. Let's not forget to add it this time as a sub view. And of course, we need to give this guy a frame as well. So I'll just go ahead and copy this. We'll paste it right below. And we'll go ahead and give this a frame. So the X is pretty simple. We'll make it 0. The Y, we're going to make this perhaps 260. So it's right below the image view. We're going to go ahead and make this frame.size.width, frame.size.width, and we'll make the height hard-coded for 70 just for the purposes of today's example. So cool, we've got a view now. We can definitely see the label here in the image view. The next thing we want to do is find a way to pass in information in here through a data source. So a data source is similar to a delegate in that it's a protocol. So I'm going to create a protocol here called image info view data source. It's going to extend any object, and basically we want to have the data source apply the data to this view. So what data do we need to populate the information here? Well, we definitely need a title for our title label, and then we also need a image URL for our image. So I'm going to go ahead and say function here. We will go ahead and say func title, or let's use a proper naming convention. So it should be image info view. And then basically the first parameter here is going to be the view. And the function name will be title for, we can say title for view. So we can actually go ahead and do it right here. So we can say image info view title for image. And we expect this function to return a string optional. So that's how we're going to get the title back. The other thing we are going to want here is image info view. And this one is going to be URL for image. And this one will return a URL optional back. So similarly, we're going to have this return the image views URL to get that image. So now we want a instance on here. So I'm going to say weak var data source is going to be of type our protocol optional. Now, similar to things like TableViews and CollectionViews, we want a reload data option on here. So I'm going to come here and we're going to create a public function. And this public func is going to be reload data. And what we basically want to do here is configure our information from the data source. So let's go ahead and create that function here. It's going to be private. We're going to say private func configure. And as soon as our view is created, we'll try to go ahead and configure here. And also when this reload data is called, we'll call configure here. Now, what do we want to actually do in configure? Well, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have a data source and make sure it's not nil here. So we'll go ahead and do that. And once we have that, we can start using its functions. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say title label dot text is going to be data source, and we're going to say image info title for image, passing in self, just like that. So there is our text, and the next thing we want to do is use this to get our URL out. So we can go ahead and say guard let image URL is going to be once again data source, and now we care about getting the URL. Now you see me passing self in here. This is basically passing a reference of the current caller, which is this view, which is just a common practice with these data sources. So the conforming side of the protocol knows who is calling the particular function. So now that we have the image URL, we want to actually get the image from the from the network. So we could actually make the call here. You could also do that in the view controller, but we're not going to really focus on that part of the architecture today. So we'll say this is a simple data task with a URL and a completion handler. So we'll say completion here. This will be data. We're going to ignore the response and the error. And then we can just unwrap this data like so. And once we have our data unwrapped here, we can go ahead and actually use it in our image view. So we can go ahead and say dispatch queue, let's try that one more time, .main, .async, self.image view, its image is going to equal a UI image with some data like that. Don't forget to say task.resume here. And let's see, looks like something got screwed up here. This should be called a image URL. We should capture weak self here. And this we want to say is self optional so we don't have a memory leak. So this is all the view part of our code done and our data source. Now let's go to the view controller and hook up the other side of it. So we have our image view here, or our info view, I should say. The next thing we're going to want to go ahead and do here, similar to implementing a table view, I can actually get rid of the background color, is we can say the info view's data source is going to be self. And you're going to see that we'll get an error here complaining, which is expected because we have not conformed to it. So we're going to say this is image info view data source, so this one here. And then it's going to ask us to bring in the required functions. So I'm just going to do them down here. We can go ahead and say image info view, and there should be one more, image info view. So we're just going to return nil from the get-go here. And now that we have all of this set up, what we want to do is actually hook up our API call. So at the bottom of view did load, we're going to say fetch data. And fetch data should basically go and get a model from this endpoint here. So what we can also go ahead and do is create that model. I'll go ahead and just stick it up here. We'll go ahead and say this is image info. It's going to be codable. It's going to have a title. And it'll also have a, I believe they call it a thumbnail URL. I might be mistaken. We might have to take a look as to what it is. So there is our thumbnail URL. So now what we can go ahead and do is create an API call here. So we'll say task is URL session shared. We want a data task once again with a URL and a completion block. This completion block will get data. We'll ignore the response. We'll get the error. We want to make sure that we actually have some data. So we'll go ahead and unwrap and bind it. We'll validate that the error is in fact nil. We're going to remember to make sure we kick off our task. And now we just want to decode the data to our JSON. So we can go ahead and say the result will be try to use JSON decoder to decode the image info.self from the data. And should it fail, we're going to print out the error because I don't recall the keys exactly. And once we have our actual results here, we're going to say self.model is going to equal results. We're going to hold the model as a global member here. So we'll say private var model. And this is going to be our image info optional. So looking pretty good. We want to make sure we capture weak self here so we can use self optional to not cause a memory leak. And let's see what else is going on. So this is yelling at me because we spelled else incorrectly. And once we've actually gone ahead and assigned our model, we can tell our view to reload data. But we want to do that on the main thread since it is a part of the UI. So we can say self.imageinfoView or infoView.reload data. So let's go ahead and give this a run. And before we actually do so, we want to fix these. So here we're saying title for image. So instead, we're going to now say model.title. And this is going to be a URL with a string. And this will go ahead and be model.the thumbnail URL. And we'll coalesce it to an optional, since this is optional, we'll coalesce it to an empty string. But this takes a URL optional back, so it's not a problem here. So let's go ahead and give this a run. I suspect we'll hit this error here because I don't remember the coding keys, but we'll figure that out together. So let's go ahead and give this guy a run. We expect our API call to be made, and we still see the black image because we have an error down here. It's saying that it couldn't find anything for thumbnail URL. So the other thing we can go ahead here and do to figure out what the actual JSON is say try JSON serialization, and we want to get a JSON object with the given data, and we can say here allowing fragments, and I'll go ahead and just print out the JSON, and this will actually be commented out while we just give this a run to see the JSON. This is a pretty nice tip. If you don't know the keys directly, you can just print them out right here. So we can see we get an ID back, we get a URL, thumbnail URL. So let's go ahead and fix up our model up here. We'll just use the URL directly, and then down here we'll also use the URL. And now we can uncomment all this business and get rid of this and give this a run one more time. And now we expect to see our actual image. Look at that, there is our green image, and boom, there is our title. Now our title is a little long, so it's getting truncated onto the next line. If you wanted to go ahead and fix that, for any reason, you can come into here and just set the label's number of lines to be 0, and we should see it line wrapping just like that. So that is the DataSource model in a nutshell. This is exactly how Apple has implemented UI TableViews, UI CollectionViews, and all the views or objects that supply data. Now the great part about doing this, instead of using like a configure function or a closure, is your data source becomes very flexible now. So as your data changes in the view controller or whoever the conformer is, you can ask your view to be reloaded. And the view is not going to be tightly coupled to this view controller, therefore you make this component highly reusable. So the premise is create a protocol, have a weak reference instance of that data source. You need a configure function, which should be private to this particular class, which uses the data source to pull out all the data. And then you also want a reload method on here just to go ahead and tell the view to try and configure itself again. So that is all I've got for you guys today. This video was pretty heavily requested after my last delegate video, so if you haven't watched that, definitely check that out as well. If you haven't hit that like button down below, don't forget to do so. I super appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel if you're into iOS, Swift, and like learning to build apps. And of course, comment down below with any video suggestions, feedback. I always love hearing from you guys, and I enjoy making the things that you guys want to see. So definitely let me know. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.